He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
They say life is stranger than fiction.
You need to have some kind of nano chainsaw, the material.
Chainsaw doesn't sound very subtle to me, Mike.
I'm talking about, diamond blades, particularly things like tungsten needles for scanning, tunneling microscopy.
But sometimes what we see in movies or read in books is so incredible that it obviously couldn't be possible. Or could it?
Yeah, if we had some way of cutting our way into these parallel worlds.
To see if they're there or not.
That would kind of resolve the matter once and for all, I think.
Yeah.
That's why you need a subtle knife.
Welcome to Sci-Fi Sci-Fact. I'm Brian Crump, and this is a podcast where we take science fiction's strangest ideas, weirdest elements, most unfeasible plot drivers, and explore if they could actually happen in real life. Maybe they already have. And in every episode, we bring in a scientist from New Zealand's MacDiarmid Institute to explain the theories behind some of fiction's more fantastic flights of fancy, if any theory exists. In this episode, Dr. Mike Price, MacDiarmid Institute postdoctoral fellow at Victoria University of Wellington, gives us his take on the subtle knife from Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials trilogy.
I saw something. Like thin strings that were almost invisible, but I felt them connect with the knife.
Yes, good. This time, don't lose sight of those strings. For each string is an opening into another unique world. Slide the knife into them and down. Make a cut. You'll feel a powerful resistance.
Okay.
Kia ora, Mike.
Kia ora.
Tell me about the subtle knife. What are its subtleties? In some ways, it doesn't sound very subtle at all. It sounds very direct, actually.
Oh, no.
What it can do.
This is a very subtle blade. So in the books, it's described as just a dull blade about 7 to 8 inches long. And it has two different edges for different purposes. And the first edge is a clear, bright steel. That's how it's described, of incomparable sharpness. And it can cut through any material in the world.
Anything.
And the other edge is silvery in colour, and that can cut actually through the fabric of space into a parallel world in the books.
Right, can cut through space-time.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what's going on there, but...
Just tell us a little bit more about His Dark Materials trilogy for those who don't read the books, which includes me, so I'm a bit curious.
Right, so the subtle knife is actually the name of the second book, because this blade is so important in the trilogy. I mean, it's quite hard to encapsulate the three books in a pithy sentence. It's based a little bit on, a lot on Milton's Paradise Lost.
Okay.
But it's kind of a modern retelling, and you could argue that the subtle knife is inspired by Saint Michael's sword in Paradise Lost, which God created that could cut through even the substance of angels, and so Saint Michael used that to wound Lucifer. And so there are those kind of themes running through it. I mean, it's set in our world, and it's set in many other fantastical worlds.
Because Paradise Lost is about what? The fall of Adam and Eve from grace in Eden, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. How humans became human.
Yeah, and
or lost touch with God. But there's also stuff about Lucifer and God, and Lucifer getting kicked out of heaven as well.
Yeah, and this series deals with all of those things, and it's got some, great storytelling. It's about Will, who is he comes to be the bearer of the subtle knife, and Lyra, who's kind of the main heroine, and they sort of mirror Adam and Eve in some respects.
I was looking for examples of a subtle knife in film or television adaptations of the books, because I know there have been some adaptations at the movies, and I think there's a big screen one. I think it was called The Golden Compass. Is that based on the first book?
Yeah, that's the first book.
I remember that coming out. I didn't go and see it, but now there's a BBC TV series.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the possibility of this subtle knife existing in our world, what is the sharpest knife that we have at the moment, Mike?
Yeah, it's a good question. There are various. It kind of depends on your definition of sharpness. This is something I've been thinking about over the last week. What even is sharpness?
All right.
But there are a few candidates. I mean, diamond blades. Diamond is very hard, and that's one of the key essences of sharpness. And people can make very, very sharp diamond blades. I mean, certainly the subtle knife is described as having a steel edge. Steel can't get very sharp. I mean,
it can't.
Let's be said.
Not
No.
even when you're sharpening. Are knives made of steel? Are kitchen knives and that kind of stuff?
Yeah. A lot of knives are made of steel, but
They seem pretty sharp to me.
Oh no, you're talking maybe microns, but the things I'm talking about, diamond blades, particularly things like tungsten needles for scanning tunneling microscopy. Which is, as a material scientist, that's something that I'm interested in, or I don't know a lot about. You can get
Is that tunneling inside the body?
No, that's tunneling between the material you're trying to image and the tip of the needle, and that tip can get to be one atom thick at its very tip of a tungsten needle.
I would have thought 1 atom is the sort of minimum possible thickness or maximum sharpness, to look at it another way that anything would be a layer 1 atom thick.
Maybe, but then you do, I think, have to consider the strength as well. That I wouldn't really be worried if you attacked me with a tungsten needle. I wouldn't be very concerned. Whereas if you came at me with
You haven't seen my kung fu moves yet, mate.
yeah. I would be very concerned that you're attacking me.
But no, Mike. Actually, you don't have to worry about my kung fu moves. Yeah, no, I haven't got no kind of bout. You're not worried about a tungsten needle, what? Because if I tried to jab you with a tungsten needle, what would happen?
It would deform pretty much immediately.
Would it break?
It's because it's a metal tungsten. It would just kind of bend, and that's what happens to your really sharp steel knives and things. The tip, you can sharpen it, but then it just sort of bends, and that's a property of metals. They're positive ions surrounded by what we would call a sea of electrons, and that means that those atoms can sort of move around a bit. They're not in a really, really rigid crystalline structure like diamond.
If we're wanting to cut something, what is the sharpest blade that we can use at the moment that won't bend once it gets really, really thin, but will actually continue to break through the material it's trying to cut?
Yeah, so one of the candidates would actually be, you go all the way back to the Stone Age, and we're talking about obsidian blades. And that's to do with their structure, the molecular atomic structure of obsidian. It's not crystalline at all. And so you can fracture that very, very cleanly because the fractures aren't affected by the underlying crystalline structure. That it's just purely along the line of stress. And so that can get to kind of almost atomic kind of thickness at the very tip. And then that's also quite strong. And so, even surgeons have tried, they've done some studies and the wounds seem to heal quicker because you're not tearing the flesh as much.
Sorry for a dumb question, but obsidian, again, that's not jade, is it, or panamu?
No. It's a type of volcanic glass.
Yes, that's right. Right.
But like you say, it's very prone to shattering. So you probably won't be operated on by an obsidian blade because they don't want the risk of a little bit of glass getting stuck in the wound or something.
What, because if you put too much force, if it comes up against too much resistance...
Yep, or some sideways force in the wrong way or something, it can shatter.
Okay. What about diamond blades?
Yeah, they're pretty good. They can't get quite as sharp as obsidian, but they're much stronger, and diamond is one of the hardest materials, and so it's not going to shatter nearly as easily.
What are we actually doing when we cut into a material or rip it? What's going on there?
I would argue, kind of thinking again about this essence of sharpness, is at a fundamental level we're breaking molecular bonds between the atoms or between molecules, and not only are we breaking those bonds, but we have to in some way separate the material. You can imagine if something was infinitely thin and it came through and just sliced all the bonds perfectly, but you didn't separate your sort of two sides away from each other, you wouldn't really notice that cut. So a knife which has a finite thickness needs to break those bonds, and you can kind of get an estimate of how much energy you need from the melting point or the boiling point. You know, diamond has a really high melting point, and that's kind of an indication of how much energy you need to break the bonds between the carbon and the diamond, and then you need to separate it apart. And the problem with this is what I'm thinking. You know, if you had something that was infinitely sharp and infinitely strong, but it was of a finite thickness, like the subtle knife, the force you're putting through that infinitely sharp tip is supposed to come from your arm. You know, in the books, the knife just effortlessly glides through lead, through iron, through crystalline materials. It even the bearer of the knife, he defeats the great armored bear.
Spoiler alert here, folks, if you haven't read the books
No spoilers.
yet.
Ulrich Bernison. He just cuts his huge iron helmet up into little bits effortlessly. And you actually can't do that without displacing the material that you're cutting. So I kind of argue you can't get this form of subtle knife just by making something really sharp. You need to make some kind of, you need to have a chainsaw.
Yeah. A chainsaw?
You need to have some kind of nano chainsaw. You know, the chainsaw is sharp because it's dragging along the edge of the blade, but it's removing that material. You know, the material.
Chainsaw doesn't sound very subtle to me, Mike.
Oh no, but this is very subtle. It's a chainsaw. It's a nano chainsaw. It's on the molecular scale.
Is that theoretically possible?
A nano chainsaw. Well,
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm going to have a look into the patent literature. But yeah, I mean, maybe there's some kind of very subtle nanotechnology that their guys use to make this knife. They're able to remove the material, because if you don't have this sort of chainsaw mechanism, then you're going to end up fracturing things. If you cut through a crystalline substance, it will fracture, it'll shatter into a million pieces, and that doesn't happen in the books. Just slices through anything.
Because even with that incredible sharpness, even if it's one atom thick, it has to displace at least one layer of atoms in the substance it's trying to break apart.
Yeah, so
and that requires force.
Yeah, that's right.
But if we had a nano chainsaw, then something in the knife has to be driving some kind of machine, doesn't it? Because the knife isn't going to run a chainsaw without any kind of energy source, is it?
No, it will need some kind of energy, but this is where maybe you get to the other edge of the blade. Maybe it's deriving its energy from other worlds.
Right.
I don't know.
Right. Well, I was going to come to the other side, which seems even less probable, and that is the ability to cut through dimensions. Is that what it's doing? I mean, when it slices through into other worlds, is that's the closest I can, in terms of my limited understanding of physics, that it could be doing.
I mean, you're cutting into a can of worms here.
Yeah.
And I'm, as a material
Thank
scientist,
you, Mike,
I'm not,
for that an analogy.
I'm not really qualified to talk about this, but there are a lot of different theories from physicists and from philosophers about the types of multiple worlds we might have. You know, do we live in a multiverse? I mean, it can get quite crazy quite quickly. But, you know, serious people do believe these things. You know, Stephen Hawking believes in some form of multiverse. String theorists, you know, people are working on string theory to try and reconcile the quantum theory with general relativity.
The weird and wonderful that happens at the quantum level,
and you know
that doesn't happen at the atom or larger level. Yeah. I mean, there are people. Brian Greene talks about that. He says there are 9 types of multiple universes that could arise from our different theories. And but broadly, there are sort of cosmological theories that come from the string theory, and then one of the interpretations of quantum mechanics is the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which certainly it's controversial, but it's not as if there aren't serious I might be asking too much of you, Mike, but how is it that the possibility of other worlds or other universes operating parallel to ours might be able to explain the contradictions that we observe in terms of the quantum world and how subatomic particles behave and the world at the larger scale that you and I exist in?
It's to do with the current accepted interpretation of quantum mechanics, the Copenhagen interpretation, which I would subscribe to. We need to invoke the collapse of the wave function. So the thing with quantum mechanics is that we have a quantum mechanical wave function, and your photon or your electron is described completely by that wave function. But when we measure it, that wave function collapses into a point like a particle, and this is to do with your wave particle duality.
Yes.
But in the many worlds interpretation, they don't need this collapse of the wave function, which is kind of, in my view, somewhat mystical, because Schrodinger's cat is both alive and dead, but just in the different worlds. They have a universal wave function, and every time there's a choice, all choices happen, but just in different worlds.
My understanding is that it makes sense. It allows you to predict things, even though it's contradictory. It allows, in terms of what we observe and what makes sense in the physical world around us right now, it allows you to make predictions at a quantum level that work. You keep on making these predictions, and they keep on being right. So the fact that there may be another or two or three or four or five universes out there helps to explain this. The problem is that we don't appear to be able to see these universes, do we?
Well, that's why you need a subtle knife. This is what a lot of these theories need. As an experimentalist, I want something that's falsifiable. We need to be able to. I think if we want to take these theories seriously.
Falsifiable, you mean you're looking at the old Karl Popper thing, you've got a theory. It's something that can be proved false. You can disprove it. It's like, I believe in God. You can't disprove that. That's not falsifiable. Am I understanding that concept right?
Yeah, and in that sense, that's not science as many of us scientists currently understand it. And so, if we had some way of looking at these, or cutting our way into these parallel worlds
to see if they're there or not,
that would kind of resolve the matter once for all, I think.
Yeah, but you might just say, well, you just haven't found the right knife yet. If you don't find that parallel universe,
maybe
just need a better knife.
I think the verdict I've come to is that this knife is more fiction than fact.
Yeah, but before we throw it out the window back into the fantasy world, explain how it might be that the energy, if it's a nano chainsaw, and I said, well, where's the energy coming to drive a chainsaw? If we can't use force, it's got to have its own energy source to little blades on the chainsaw to break through things to have the sharpest possible knife. How might the other side, being able to cut into a different universe, create energy for the side that works on our physical world?
That is a very interesting question. We know in the books that one of the subtle things about the knife, and again, spoiler alert, is when it's cutting between these worlds, it's sort of cutting into the void and it's releasing specters and things. And maybe Pullman was referring to, probably not. It's
energy?
Ridiculous. Yeah, you've got, there's energy of the vacuum. Maybe it's coming from dark energy. In terms of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, you've got something called Wigner's friend, which is kind of, it's a thought experiment like Schrodinger's cat on steroids. It's like you have Wigner as the physicist, and he has put his friend in a box, and his friend is doing a Schrodinger's cat type experiment.
So let me get this straight. Wigner's friend has got Schrodinger's cat in a box, and Wigner's friend's in a box as well.
Yeah.
And sometimes you open the box and Vigner's friend's there with Schrodinger's cat, and sometimes you open the box and Vigner's friend's not there, not with Schrodinger's cat.
No, Vigner's friend's always there.
But the cat may not be.
But the cat is maybe dead or maybe alive.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Sci-Fi Sci-Fact, hosted by me, Brian Crump, produced by Andrew Robertson, and of course, made possible thanks to the incredible knowledge of those brilliant scientists at the MacDiarmid Institute. You can find more episodes of Sci-Fi Sci-Fact on the RNZ Podcasts page. RNZ Podcasts are also available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or pretty much wherever you might find your podcasts. And make sure to follow us so you don't miss out on any new episodes.